Before the formal introduction, I just want to do, first of all, this wouldn't happen without Humanities New York. They made it happen. And wish them and us luck that they keep doing it, okay? And also, we've been partners quite a few times on both events, Sonnenberg, and I'm on the board of Sonnenberg, and I've also been with the Meeting House forever. And we're very, very happy you all came. And I think Joan, where is Joan?
She's over here.
I think Joan is going to do a more formal introduction. I just wanted to tell you that our next event is scheduled for Wood Library, and the programs are there. However, that speaker lives in Chicago, and we all decided that planning on a plane ride right about now is not a great idea. And so this will be a virtual event. So you will be able to Zoom in from Wood Library, but just don't come to Wood Library looking for the program, okay? And we'll always check our website to see if there's an update on that. And we will soon be sending out an email, if you signed up on our email list, to when you can watch 3 events that have happened so far. And one is happening today, actually. And you'll get an email notice, or you can just check our website for when that's, our website will have a link taking you to Zoom, okay? So, join us virtually from Wood Library. Okay.
You want to mention Michelle too?
We also have a different program, not funded by Humanities New York, but it's going to end our season. It's at Canandaigua, and Michelle Shenandoah is going to speak on, just like I had never heard of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, I had never heard of the rematriation project of the Onondaga women, and that's what she's going to talk about at Canandaigua. And that was made possible by the Indian Affairs Committee of the Quakers, of the New York Meeting Quakers. I think, Joan, you want to do your introduction? And this is Professor Joan Bryant from Syracuse University, who's also on the board of the Quaker Meeting.
Thank you. I'm honored to introduce my colleague, Marcia Robinson. She's faculty in the Religion Department at Syracuse University, and she teaches a host of things. I have a long list. I won't read everything. But she teaches on one area of her research on Søren Kierkegaard, the 19th century Danish philosopher. Her graduate work was on Kierkegaard and art history. So she teaches many courses on Kierkegaard, as well as women, abolition, and religion in 19th century America, seminars on Frances Harper, which she's discussing today, courses on African American religious thought and culture, Black religious existentialism, and the list goes on and on. Obviously, she's grounded in 19th century philosophy and religious history, and art history, and a few other things. Okay, so I won't say more. Before she came to Syracuse, she taught at UC Davis and at Eden Theological Seminary. She's working on 2 manuscripts at this point, one on Harper called The Noblest Types of Womanhood, Frances Harper, Anti-Slavery Women of Maine, and the Potential of America, obviously rooted in Harper's social history, her intellectual and theological influences, as well as her literary works. You'll learn more about that today. Well, it's a little slice of it. And her other book that she's working on is on Kierkegaard on religion. So I'm honored to introduce Professor Robinson. We've had many conversations about 19th century American thought and commiserated about teaching. And I hope that you all enjoy her talk and ask challenging questions. She welcomes those. Thank you, Marcia, for joining us. Thank you, Joe.
First, I just want to do a test to make sure that the people all the way back there can actually hear me. Okay, good. as I want to keep you all protected. Actually, folks, I tend to lecture in two masks. So let me say thank you to all of you for coming today to my talk. Thank you to Professor Bryant for her lovely introduction. Thank you to Kathleen Hendricks and the board of the Farmington Quaker Meeting House Museum, and to David Hutchings, the director here of Sonnenberg Gardens. Thank you all for your hospitality and your kindness. That's just very much appreciated. So I'm going to be talking about Frances Harper, or race and women's rights. And as Professor Bryant just mentioned, I approached Frances Harper paying close attention, actually taking very seriously her religious orientation. I'm not going to dig a whole lot into that today, but it will be emergent. Okay. But let me begin with a little introduction to her, and then I will move into my topic. So Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was the leading African-American female writer and social reformer of the 19th century. From 1854 until her death in 1911, anti-slavery societies, reform organizations of varying commitments, churches, political and civic leaders all over what was then the United States pursued her, invited her to give lectures on the abolition of slavery, the prohibition of alcohol or temperance, the rights of women, and the moral, spiritual, educational, and economic uplift of African Americans. All of these people and organizations, black and white alike, admired her for her eloquence, her social and political insight, her earnest commitment to social justice, her deep religious conviction, and her dignified comportment on the social reform lecture circuit. Indeed, they all celebrated the way in which she deftly integrated all of these things into one public persona. The writer, Grace Greenwood, actually that was her pen name, dubbed her the Bronx Muse. As the Bronx Muse, Watkins Harper often integrated poems, biblical stories, and witty expressions, you're going to hear a little bit of that, into her lectures in a manner that captivated, entertained, enlightened, and moved her audience to tears, laughter, and action. This was especially the case with her anti-slavery speeches, in which she used such poems as Be Active and Free Labor to call her listeners to do more than merely sympathize with the plight of her enslaved people. Compelled by the power of her eloquence, the pathos of her words, the truth of her calls for justice, and the refinement of her bearing, people flocked to her speeches, bought her books, read her poems, stories, and essays in a wide variety of newspapers and magazines, black and white, religious and reform, political and social, and I'm going to give you a little sampling of those shortly. In Maine, where she came into her own as an abolitionist and temperance orator, in Maine these two things went together, anti-slavery and temperance went together in Maine. Some of her audiences even took her words to heart and sought to practice the reforms to which she called them, particularly the boycott of slave-produced goods that she saw as a means to promote their political campaigns for free labor. Alcohol was a slave-produced good. Maine was the state that was the shippers in the United States at the time. So they were the folks bringing the rum from the Caribbean into the United States. All right, so now you see a little bit of why those two things went together. All right. So the pictures are really small for you, and I'm sorry about that, but I'm trying to give you a little collage of reformers. Because all of the activity that Harper was involved in and the recognition that she received naturally meant that she came into contact with some of the most prominent social reformers of her day. From the 1840s until the end of her life, leaders in the African Methodist Episcopal and African Methodist Episcopal Zion churches, so the AME traditions, and Black convention and broad social reform movements, leaders in these institutions such as Daniel Payne, John Mifflin Brown, Jermaine Logan, John Mercer Langston, Frederick Douglass, and William C. Nail, not to mention her uncle and cousin William Watkins Jr. and William James Watkins, respectively, supported her efforts early and late. Douglass, the most prominent African-American leader of the 19th century, published her work in various of his newspapers. So he's actually pictured here at the top here of the screen. I'll try to point them out, and maybe afterwards I can come back to this slide and you can look at more of these people if you'd like to. Okay. Watkins Harper also worked with Douglass in the equal rights and women's rights movements from the end of the Civil War onward. In the 1850s, she met and published in the anti-slavery newspaper of William Lloyd Garrison, the most well-known and controversial abolitionist of his time. And Garrison is right here next to Douglass in the picture frame there. And I'll actually say a little bit more about him in a minute, because he was involved in the publication of one of the works of Harper's that I'm going to highlight for you. During the same period, so the 1850s, Harper worked with and published in the anti-slavery newspaper of Mary Ann Shadd Cary, an advocate of Black immigration to Canada and the first African-American female editor of a newspaper. And her picture is right here in the center. After Harper left Maine in the mid-1850s, she worked with Lucretia Mott, Mary Grew, and others in the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, and she went from there to work regularly with Garrison, Wendell Phillips, and others in the American Anti-Slavery Society. This work took her to Ohio, where she had actually already been before. She had taught there at an A&E school. And it's here in Ohio that she meets and marries an African-American farmer named Fenton Harper. So the Harper part of her name is her married name. Watkins is her maiden name. And as you can see from the carte de visite that I have illuminated here, she used all of her names, and she abbreviated the Ellen and Watkins on print material from time to time. So here is our woman of the hour in her carte de visite. So when she go visit somebody, you hand people your card there. All right. From the end of the Civil War to the turn to the 20th century, she worked in the women's rights and temperance movements with figures as diverse as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Julia Ward Howe, and Frances Willard, the respective leaders of the progressive wing of the American women's rights movement, the Association for the Advancement of Women, and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU. So here's Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. These are both young pictures of them. Here is Frances Willard, and here is Julia Ward Howe, who's known for her battle hymn of the Republic. She was an abolitionist. Okay. And from the end of the century until Harper's death, she worked in a number of these aforementioned movements and institutions, as well as the Black Women's Club movement with Ida Wells Barnett, the leading Black female anti-lynching activist of the late 19th and early 20th century. And here is Ida Wells Barnett here. Right underneath her is Lucretia Mott, and in the middle here is Grace Greenwood. Sarah Jane Lippincott was her actual name. All right. Now, two contemporaries summed up Watkins Harper's prominence when they spoke of her as a figure for emulation. an exemplar of the nation's best womanhood. The African Methodist Episcopal Church Review, one of several black periodicals in which she regularly published her work, called her, quote, a woman of our race worthy of imitation, unquote. And Phoebe Hannaford, a white Universalist minister activist and relative of Lucretia Mott, sang her praises in her oft-quoted book, Daughters of America. Frances E.W. Harper, she says, is one of the most eloquent women lecturers in the country. As one listens to her clear, plaintive, melodious voice and follows the flow of her musical speech in her logical presentation of truth, melody and truth, one can but be charmed with her oratory and rhetoric and forget that she is of the race once enslaved in our land. She is one of the colored women of whom white women may be proud, and to whom the abolitionists can point and declare that a race which could show such women never ought to have been held in bondage. Now, contemporary readers might find some portions of Hannaford's characterization a little irksome, but the point is nevertheless clear and positive. Watkins Harper came to prominence precisely because she knew how to appeal to the hearts and capture the minds and consciences of her audience. Well, that's very interesting. My slides just changed there, okay, on their own. Okay, there might be a little animation embedded in one of these slides. Okay, nevertheless, what I wanted to do, so that sort of gives you a rundown of the who's who in the social reform world and Harper's place in it. So that's a quick sketch of that. But here what I want to do is give you a quick sketch, if you will, of her lifespan and her work and personal life intermingled with that. So Harper was born in 1825, and when she was born is some question. And she died in 1911, and even that, there's some discrepancies around that, okay? But she was born a free person of color. She was raised in her mother's family's household. And she was educated by her uncle, whom I've mentioned, William Watkins Jr., who was a minister in the Methodist Church. He was also a teacher, a very prominent teacher in Baltimore. So she was someone who was raised in a community very much focused on freedom. So when she left her uncle's school, she went into an apprenticeship as a domestic and a dressmaker. She then moved to being a teaching assistant for her uncle, and her uncle, no doubt through his connections with the AME Church and Daniel Payne in particular, helped her to get a teaching position in Ohio at an AME school in Columbus. After she left that school, she went to Pennsylvania, to York, Pennsylvania, where she taught at a public school. And it was while she was at this public school that she read a story about a man, a free black man, who had been lured into her home state of Maryland, which, like many states, had anti-black codes. This man, as an outsider, was not supposed to come into Maryland. But he was lured there because he was basically a day laborer. He needed work. So he went from town to town getting jobs. And so he went into Maryland unbeknownst of these anti-black codes. And he ends up in jail because he can't pay the fine. and he is sold into slavery. Now his whole story gets laid out in an anti-slavery newspaper in Philadelphia. Harper wasn't in Philadelphia just yet. She was still in York, Pennsylvania, teaching. But she read this man's story, and she said to her friend, who was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, which she became involved in before this story, she told him that it was on this man's grave, because this man ends up dying trying to get free, that it was on his grave that she declared that she would work for the abolitionist cause. So his case was a little known case outside of what people might call today the Dale Bar Law. So they're coming together there, Delaware, Virginia, and Maryland, but we have to put Pennsylvania in this picture as well. It was a little known case outside of that area, but it was the result of the passage of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. And I won't go into all of the particulars of his case, but the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law effectively made ordinary citizens bounty hunters. The bounty hunting attached to Texas anti-abortion law has a precedent in the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. Okay, so this basically moves Harper into abolitionism. So the place where she would land and the place where she would really develop her own voice was Maine. And this was in the mid-1850s, from 54 to 56. She was in Maine with a group of women who were abolitionists and temperance advocates, but who were doing their work through political parties. They were grassroots campaigners. Okay, yes, these slides definitely do have some embedded animation that I forgot to remove. Okay. Anyway, these women were involved in political campaigning. And so Harper was on the anti-slavery political campaign trail in Maine from 54 to 56. By the time she left there, she was already moving into being a veteran abolitionist, and that's when she goes to work for the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society and the American Anti-Slavery Society. And as I said, when she did the latter, she went back to Ohio, and this is where she met her husband. And they were only married for a few years before he died. He died before the end of the Civil War, and so she went right back into the lecture circuit. She actually, in a certain way, had never left it, but her work was tamped down by her being a mother and a wife. So she was very much involved in Ohio anti-slavery activity. But during the Reconstruction years, she would go south, and she would lecture in the South for nearly 10 years. During the same time is when she starts to work in the women's rights movement. Okay, so that's from the end of the Civil War until her death. Now for the sample of some of her works. So here's her bestseller, people. Poems on Miscellaneous Subjects, which went into various editions. And you can see it pretty much runs concurrently with this first part of her anti-slavery activity. So you can see that I've highlighted some of the poems, and these poems showing up in the various editions. That's just a little selection of the poems and essays. So it was actually a collection of poems and essays that she published there. And she would sell her little book here at her lectures. So it was a way for her to make a living, essentially. Several other works of hers that I want to highlight include a speech and an essay entitled Our Greatest Want, and I'm going to say a little bit more about it later. We Are All Bound Up Together, The Great Problem to Be Solved, John and Jacob, as you can see, a dialogue on women's rights, and I'm going to give you that one. Enlightened Motherhood, Iowa Leroy, or Shadows Uplifted, and Woman's Political Future, which I should have put in quotation marks, so excuse me for that. That's actually not a book, it's a speech and essay. Now, of these works, Iowa Leroy is actually her masterpiece. It's a novel, and it's a post-Reconstruction novel in which she focuses on the end of slavery and the emergence of African Americans as citizens. And there are lots of other sub-issues that run through this text. But you see that it is a work that belongs to her late career, along with Enlightened Motherhood, which in many ways its themes show up in Iowa Leroy, as do much of her women's rights and African American rights work. So there are three works here that I want to focus on in the rest of my talks here. So as I move into the body of my talk, I'm going to be highlighting works from different portions of the second half, if you will, of her life. We Are All Bound Up Together is her maiden women's rights speech. John and Jacob, a dialogue on women's rights, which you see is from the 1880s. This is a poem. And Woman's Political Future is an essay speech that Harper gave at the World's Congress of Representative Women, which was held during the Columbian Exposition. All right, so now I'm just going to leave up here a picture, a close-up of the carte de visite picture for you to view as I talk about Harper's position on race and women's rights, focusing on those highlighted works. All right. Each of these works, so I'm just going to go back for a minute, just so that you see the each of these works, We Are All Bound Up Together, John and Jacob, and Woman's Political Future, each of them illuminate in a distinctive way, as well as in similar ways, Harper's position on race and women's suffrage. And I want to begin with the poem, John and Jacob, because it's exemplary of Harper's work. So then here are two men having a conversation about the issue of women's rights. Jacob is what you might say a more conservative figure, John a more progressive. So here goes. And Jacob kicks things off. I don't believe a single bit in those newfangled ways of women running to the polls and voting nowadays. I like the good old-fashioned times when women used to spin. And when you came from work, you knew your wife was always in. Now there's my Betsy, just as good as any wife need be, who sits and tells me day by day that women are not free. And when I smile and say to her, you surely make me laugh. This talk about your rights and wrongs is nothing else but chaff. And then John says, now Jacob, I don't think like you. I think that Betsy Ann has just as good a right to vote as you or any man. And then Jacob says, now John, do you believe for true in women running round? And when you come to look for them, they are not to be found? Pray, who would stay at home to nurse, to cook, to wash and sew, while women marched unto the polls? That's what I want to know. And John says, Who stays at home when Betsy Ann goes out day after day to wash and iron, cook and sew because she gets her pay? I'm sure she wouldn't take quite as long to vote and go her way as when she leaves her little ones and works out day by day. Jacob says, well, I declare that is the truth. To vote, it don't take long, but then I kind of think somehow that women's voting's wrong. John says, the masters thought before the war that slavery was right, but we who felt the heavy yoke didn't see it in that light. Some thought that it would never do for us in southern lands to change the fetters on our wrists for the ballot in our hands. Now, if you don't believe 'twas right to crowd us from the track, how can you push your wife aside and try to hold her back? Jacob, but John, I think for women's feet, the polls a dreadful place. To vote with rough and brutal men seems like a deep disgrace. But Jacob, if the polls are vile, where women shouldn't be seen, why not invite them in to help us men to make them clean? Well, wrong is wrong and right is right for woman as for man. I almost think that I will go and vote with Betsy Ann. I hope you will and show the world you can be brave and strong, a noble man who scorns to do the feeblest woman wrong. That's the kind of result Harper would get. Several things stand out in this snappy dialogue of a poem. For me, the most striking is the way that she makes women's rights a natural outgrowth of right human relations. She, however, does not situate this argument in a broad or general American context, but rather in a particular community of people, namely her own, since the conversation is between two black men. Aiming her social reform ideas at a black audience, and at black men in particular, was not unusual for her. She often challenged African Americans, men and women, directly and indirectly, not to follow the ways of the majority culture. For example, in her 1859 speech and essay, Our Greatest Want, she directly challenges both black men and women not to be uncritically capitalistic. Here, she challenges black men expecting black women to conform to the white female gender convention or ideology of domesticity, also known as the cult of true womanhood. In this poem, however, she is more indirect in her approach, even though her message is direct. That is, she herself does not directly address black men, but rather has one male character challenge the other, indicating thereby that black men were not monolithic in their thinking. This challenge is also the way that she makes women's rights, and more particularly black women's right to vote, an issue grounded in right human relations. Although she was herself a master at manipulating, even subverting the cult of true womanhood, but that's the ideology of domesticity. Here, in the more conservative male character, Harper begins to unfurl the problem at the core of this ideology as she addresses the problem of some black men embracing it, namely, the assumed, purportedly natural authority and power of men over women. Now, the cult said that women had moral power, okay? So she's not unaware of that. Deploying a moral power that she believed belonged to men as well as women, Harper shows how a black man's focus on his own convenience could make him insensitive and inattentive to what black women endured as wives, mothers, and laborers. But she doesn't stop here. With men like her cousin and Frederick Douglass, both of whom worked in the women's rights movement, she uses her progressive character to show that other black men could be attentive to and supportive of black women's rights and women's rights by realizing not only the injustice of blocking black women from voting, but also the need for a more appropriate understanding of themselves as males, which was not to be the dominators of women. Indeed, she sensitizes her progressive male character so much so that he attacks the unreasonableness of expecting black women to conform to prevailing female gender conventions aimed at middle and upper class white women when they were laborers like them, not just mothers and wives. Similarly, by bringing up the way that slavery had negatively affected them as black men, her progressive character reminds her conservative one of the wrongs he had himself endured as a slave so that he could conclude for himself that domination is good for no one. This was a classic abolitionist use of the golden rule of Matthew 7:12, the Gospel of Matthew. But in Harper's hands, it still had the power to cut to the heart of the matter and compel her avowedly Christian audiences to empathize. Harper's progressive male character also recognizes that black women were still in a more vulnerable position in American society than they, just as they had been in slavery. Since as laborers, black women were still subjected to the same abuses, often sexual, that they had been subjected to as slaves. With this, Harper brings home her point. If those in stronger positions, even very modest ones, would recognize and respect those pushed into vulnerable ones, if those folks were to recognize the vulnerable ones as of equal value and capability as they could join forces and rectify the problems plaguing the nation, including making politics itself less corrupt. And this was an echo of something that Harper recognized in the women that she worked with in Maine, who were grassroots campaigners. Bringing women's rights back to right human relations and to women working with men to make America a more just and truly democratic society, particularly in regard to race, is exactly what she does in her maiden women's rights speech at the 11th National Women's Rights Convention in May of 1866 in New York City. It is also exactly what she does in her May 1893 address, Woman's Political Future, which she gave at the World's Congress of Representative Women, which itself met at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago and was identified as the White City. In the former speech, so that's her maiden speech, where she recounts the particular wrongs that she and other black women had faced as widows and in trying to ride public transportation, given that they were compelled to work, she makes a very sharp point to white women, which she elaborates in the latter speech. She says that, "I do not believe," so this is a quotation, "I do not believe that giving the woman the ballot is immediately going to cure all the ills of life. I do not believe that white women are dewdrops just exhaled from the skies. I think that like men, they may be divided into three classes: the good, the bad, and the indifferent. The good would vote according to their convictions and principles, the bad as dictated by prejudice or malice, and the indifferent will vote on the strongest side of the question with the winning party." Unquote. In other words, white women's getting access to the levers of power through the vote was not enough. The nation did not, quote, simply need need more voters, but better voters, unquote. White women needed to realize that they had a role to play in helping to develop a quote-unquote national conscience. That is, they had a responsibility, just as all Americans did, men and women, to help, quote, create a healthy public sentiment that would demand justice as the right of every race, that would brand with everlasting infamy the lawless and brutal cowardice that lynches, burns, and tortures their own countrymen, unquote. Like men, white and black, they needed to do more than think about their own benefits, privileges, or advancement, while ignoring the quote-unquote wrongs and the violence inflicted upon people of color. Injustices that she had referenced in her 1866 speech in talking about white women reformers failing to address the poorer classes of their own people who were terrorizing blacks. Injustices that she was still addressing in her 1893 speech as the nation stood at its lowest point in the turn to the 20th century. Indeed, injustices that white women themselves were often complicit with their men. And so in 1893, just as she had in 1866, Harper called them to cultivate in themselves and to help cultivate in their families hearts responsive to the, quote, herald angels of peace on earth and goodwill to men, unquote. The message of Christmas is the message of right relations. As people claiming to be followers of Christ or admirers of Jesus, which is to say they weren't necessarily followers of Christ, she called them to cultivate in themselves and to help cultivate in their families an attitude that recognized that, quote, we are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity. And society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul, unquote. According to her, by 1893, women had already had some influence in, quote, labor, the home, society, literature, legislative halls, the press, the church, the school, and now, Harper maintained, to, quote, to her is coming the added responsibility of political power in the vote. Women should use this common power for the glory of God and the good of mankind. And we can say humankind, because Harper was definitely inclusive. For power without righteousness is one of the most dangerous forces in the world, unquote. Just as with her use of the golden rule in the poem John and Jacob, Harper appealed to a familiar strategy among social reform women, namely a strategic use of woman's purported moral influence. Here, though, she was quite open that she had no investment in the essentialism of the cult of domesticity that had championed women as natural moral exemplars because they were naturally religious. As she put it at the World's Congress of Representative Women, echoing her 1885 poem and her characterizations of the efforts of the anti-slavery women of Maine, quote, political life in our country has plowed in muddy channels and needs the infusion of clearer and cleaner waters. I am not sure that women are naturally so much better than men, that they will clear the stream by the virtue of their womanhood. It is not through sex, but through character, that the best influence of women upon the life of the nation must be exerted, unquote. And that character would need to be cultivated by them in concert with their men and others as it needed to be by anyone else. However, as the oppressed, marginalized, and often abused sex, black women weren't the only ones being abused, they were in a position to know something of wrongs and to realize, like Harper's character Jacob, that domination is good for no one. As a supporter of women's rights then, Harper was fundamentally a Christian humanist. That is, her support of women's rights, as her support of human rights broadly, was a product of a decidedly religious humanism grounded in Christian ethics, particularly the justice, mercy, and love modeled by Jesus in the scriptures, and coupled with the nation's revolutionary values, divinely endowed life, liberty, equality, and well-being, drawn from those same scriptures. She had learned and appropriated this humanism from her educated activist uncle, Reverend William Watkins Jr. But it would always be her maternal grandmother and mother who would most personally represent such a position to her. For these women, both born slaves, taught her what true women's liberation meant. They had labored tirelessly to free themselves, not for themselves alone, but so that she, that is Frances, and all the children in their family could be born and live free. Thank you. And as Professor Bryant says, I am very happy to take your questions.
Way in the beginning, this was a mask problem, I think.
Oh, okay.
You said she was called some kind of muse.
The bronze.
Bronze.
Like the belt, B-R-O-N-Z-E. Bronze, sorry about that.
Okay.
Yes, it is a math problem. Yes, ma'am.
Did she ever do any kind of writings for school children?
Yeah, she did.
What were some
I mean, typically it would be poetry.
Okay.
So, I mean, Harper in many ways, I'd say, in terms of her as a writer, she was a poet fundamentally. And some of the women that she worked with Maine, they were always interested in bringing children into issues about what it meant to be American. And I'm not saying that Harper wrote poems in that vein, but these women were very much working in that vein. And so I think Harper got some encouragement, if you will, to write poetry for children. I'll have to dig around to remember some specific pieces. But yeah, I know that she did write poems for children. She had a daughter, and she was the stepmother to her husband's 4 children, because her husband had been a widower before she met him. So she basically had 5 children.
Do you know who published any of those writings?
She probably included them in some other volumes because she tended to collect poetry in a miscellaneous type of way. And so just like that volume that I said was her best-selling, Poems on Miscellaneous Subjects, she doesn't have anything in there that I recall anyway that's aimed at children. But she would put she would put different poems together. So there are a number of her volumes that are just poems, essentially. So I would really have to dig around to find some of those. It's not a whole lot of them as I recall. I just remember coming across some where she has a grandfather, as in one where she has a grandfather talking to a child, basically.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes?
Is it known whether any of her writings were published in periodicals?
Oh, yes.
Newspapers, and was it out for the general readership as well as
It
those
was.
who bought books?
Yes, she published in everything, basically. She saw the value in newspapers as the way to disseminate the ideas that she had and that she wished to share. And so she published, she tended to publish in church papers, reform newspapers, community papers, but anybody who would publish her stuff, basically, she would put the work out there so it could be to a broad audience. So yes, she was always aiming at a very broad audience. Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am.
If I'm understanding correctly, she was at times challenging white women.
Mm-hmm. Directly.
at some of these meetings.
Mhm.
Have you researched what their reactions were? And because quite frankly, I haven't read too much about her until recently.
I'm just going back to this screen.
Right.
Because, I mean, some of the things that you're asking, you kind of come across these things, not because you're looking for them, but
Right.
because you're looking at something else. So I was reading through Lucretia Mott's papers, for example.
Okay.
And Lucretia Mott made this comment about Harper that you could tell that there was some tension between these two women.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah, and so she wasn't always necessarily well received in these remarks. And in fact, Lucretia Mott says in one of these remarks that she says against Harper, something like, she's too self-centered. It basically came down to something like that. And I think Lucretia Mott was used to being right.
I bet she felt she had, it sounds to me that Frances was at time challenging them
Yeah,
because they were not doing enough.
right.
And perhaps Lucretia Mott certainly had earned her gravitas in terms of abolition.
Yeah,
But that doesn't mean that you sometimes can't be told that you're not continuing the work. Slavery has been abolished, but the work needs to be continued.
right.
Is that where Frances was kind of coming from?
Yeah, in some ways, yes. Because the abolitionists, when emancipation came, when the war was over, when the amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments were passed, a lot of the abolitionists said, okay, we're done. And Harper's like, no. And you all know this, because you all have always known that all reforms tend to be interconnected. And people like Lucretia Mott was aware of that. I mean, in fact, one of the things that made her very progressive, just like the Grimke sisters, is that they were aware that in fighting for slavery, they were also fighting to help black people get out of positions of poverty, to get education. They were aware of all these things, but they didn't necessarily want to be challenged by someone who was intelligent. The assumption was always that they were to be in the subordinate position. And so you could say Harper ran into that kind of tension, just like Frederick Douglass did with William Lloyd Garrison, who didn't want him becoming a more literate person, basically, because it took away the slave aesthetic, if you will. The more refined Douglass became, the more he also could challenge people.
Yeah, he challenged him from that. He didn't want him to get mad.
And I have the suspicion, because Lucretia Mott, like Mary Grew and the other women who were part of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, they were actually the money. They were the ones who were running the money in the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. And I know that there was a bit of a fight there about what Harper was asking of them. So there's some contention here, because Harper would stand up for herself. Basically, she would not simply accept whatever people wanted to put on her. So those are good questions. Yes. Yes, sir.
She's kind of a contemporary with George Whitefield. So was she an evangelist also in her Christian beliefs?
Now, this is a very good question. It's also a tricky one. Because Methodists are considered, and especially today, and rightfully so, because they developed and propagated what would become evangelical kinds of tactics. So they're rightfully considered to be in that camp, so to speak. But Harper's religiosity wasn't exactly there.
Okay.
And the reason that I say this is because Harper's religiosity, I think, developed, well, let me start again. Her uncle, who was her pastor, as well as her teacher, was very much compelled by the way in which some founding figures, for example, and some that we don't tend to think of, like Benjamin Rush, for example, were looking at the way in which religion was not about the specificity of, and that doctrinal and ecclesiastical, was not about the specificity of all these groups. Protestants are still subdividing, by the way. That it wasn't about, that kind of a fight. It was about how do we human beings be with each other. So Harper's religion, her spirituality, because I'd say, in a certain sense, she has a spiritual sense, so far as I've been able to tell, that has everything to do with how she understands human being and human relations. This is, by the way, why I call her a humanist. I'm taking that word in its most basic senses as to be concerned with things human. That's because I'm a classicist in this. By the way, she is her uncle reading the classics.
Right. Well, even in the verse that you quoted of her, it's just the verse of the golden rule.
Right.
Do unto others as you would have done unto you.
Right.
So again, I think that really
Right.
strengthens that
Right.
statement.
But the key thing about what you were saying is that the language that he uses, this is language that people are going to recognize as belonging to Methodists,
Sure.
as well as other groups, who are part of the awakenings. So when we think evangelical, we're also thinking about these awakenings.
Right. And that's what Whitfield's about. It's the second great
exactly.
awakening. Yeah.
And Whitfield, by the way, is a very entrepreneurial kind of person. All right. There's another key element into this with regard to the awakenings. And that is this whole idea of perfectibility, that human beings can change things, that when they are endowed with the Spirit of God, now they can live a very different kind of life. I think that's a very compelling idea for a lot of people at this time. And many abolitionists, by the way, they are connected to this movement, and their tactics are connected that way. So somebody like William Lord Garrison, for example, he has a creed, an abolitionist creed. And so he is using the language of evangelicalism, if you will, of the 19th century, which is different really than what happens, 20th century. But he is using that language of relations and perfectibility, because, by the way, these were also places where integration was happening. And so, religion was concretely bodying forth, if you will, what was potential for American society. But, there's all kinds of tensions in that.
Right.
All kinds of tensions in those implications, too. But that's a great question. Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious about her going south during Reconstruction. Why did she go down there? Who was she addressing her message to? How people reacted to her there? And how dangerous was it for her?
Very. Very. But a woman being a social reformer was very dangerous anywhere. So what she was doing was dangerous, quite frankly. And she was alone a lot of times. But now, as for the South, so you have all these newly freed people. And these people need some help. And so Harper saw it as her task to try to go and help women, for example. She was always focusing, for the most part, on women. And she was concerned about helping women to get on their feet, to organize. But she was really concerned about families and family life. And so she would talk to these women about their, what was going on in their families. And she would go and give speeches. That's what Harper did, basically. She'd go and give speeches. But she would listen to these women. Now, she had been doing this for a very long time because as someone active in the Underground Railroad, she was listening to women who were running away from slavery. She was listening to their stories. She would listen to these women's stories about being brutalized, for example. And so she was always concerned about the welfare of women and children. So this is why she went south. Now, of course, there was a lot of activity going on in the South after the Civil War. The part of the rebuilding of the South included building schools. And so Harper would sometimes be connected to some of that activity that was going on in the South. She was also talking a lot about politics, folks, and talking a lot about the violence that was happening. And blacks and whites would come to her talks. And the whites would sometimes be quite shocked. One man said to another man, "She can't be black. She must be painted," is what this man actually said. But Harper would speak about the whole problem of slavery to this society and what was needed in terms of the people and their attitudes to rebuild this society. So she was always trying to focus on how do we make the society better, and she thought that homes, families, were the centerpiece of this, which is why she spent a lot of her time talking about it.
I have a question.
Oh, yes.
Actually,
Yes,
one is really simple. When you look at this picture, she looks pregnant to me. Do you think she was?
Well,
It's the right period for a pregnant disease, and
it is. She could have been. She only had one child. And that was Mary. I mean, she could have been. It's possible.
just a thought.
Mhm.
Like,
It's possible.
I'm
Actually, I have to think about that a little bit more.
yeah.
Yeah, it is possible. Yeah, it's possible.
Okay.
Second question.
So this one's a little harder,
Uh-huh.
or maybe not. So many people, like, I think of Elizabeth Cady Stanton being so hard on the church as
Yeah.
an anti-woman institution.
Yes.
And I know Harper was really active in temperance and the WCTU, and I'm wondering if one of her main audiences wasn't women in the church who were also WCTU or temperance people. And I'm wondering if she had an effect on the church as an institution in terms of like the AME church or White Methodists or anybody, in terms of opening up leadership and ministerial positions to women. Did she challenge the hierarchy of churches in any way? And was her main audience women in the churches?
She has a piece, and I'm not remembering right now exactly what piece this is. But she has a piece, and I want to say it's a poem of hers, maybe some type of long poem, where she is challenging the exclusion of women in the pulpit. And so I know that she was certainly capable of doing that. More often, though, she was critiquing uneducated male ministers because she felt as though the ministry should be literate. Should actually be thinkers. And, you know, that was something that could certainly connect, if you will, with her pushing women. Also, her support of women, that's what I mean. Her support of women being in the ministry as well. I think that she did not think that either ministry or theology was something that was the domain only of men. Well, in many ways, Harper herself is thinking religiously. So she's an exemplification of that, and she's doing it through this literature. I mean, she, in many ways, You can read some of her characters, for example, in Iola Roy, Iola herself, for example, as this kind of a character. Even though Iola isn't trying to be, a literal minister, but she thinks as well as any of these other ministerial characters about the religious. So I think it's there. Now, as for other influence with regard to the church, I think Harper was, I think she was a very careful person. So that's the reason I said that she was good at manipulating the cult of domesticity. She knew that it was expected of women. And her whole concern was to explode it, basically. The religious, which is precisely what Elizabeth Cady Stanton hated about it, was oppressive of women. And Harper basically said it's oppressive of women because God is a man. God is made his male power. And Harper didn't read God like that.
Yeah, but who was your Christ born from?
That's exactly what she said. And in fact, what she said was, neither Jesus nor Moses would have been the figures they were without their mothers. So she was often rereading these biblical texts to say women shouldn't be cut out. But Harper, as you can see, she could have her way of coming back at that point indirectly, but when it hit, she was being quite forceful in that. But she would always try to present it in such a way as to get that person who would normally be opposed to her position to walk with her to that conclusion. I thought I saw someone had it.
I just have a follow-up.
Oh, yes.
It seems to me she would have been a soulmate to Matilda Jocelyn Gage. Did she ever have any encounter with her? I know they were in different orbits.
Well, Gage was even more radical than Elizabeth Cady Stanton about religion and church. But in any case, I don't know that they knew each other that well. I'm sure that they probably encountered each other because Gage and Harper were running in the same circles. So I would doubt that she didn't know who Gage was, but in terms of their having a connection, that I am not aware of.
Did she have any relationship with Harriet Tubman?
That I don't think she did. She knew Harriet. She knew of at least Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman, like her, was a Marylander, but Eastern Shore, like Frederick Douglass and James Pennington, they were all Eastern Shore slaves. And Harriet Tubman was ahead of her a number of years. And Harriet Tubman was, in many ways, a different sphere than Harper. But Harper very much had her in mind when she was talking about black men and women being Moses, because that was a name given to Tubman. She was the Moses of her people. Harper says that our greatest one, by the way, who will stand up and be a Moses for our people? So she's got. I think Tubman certainly. Rattling around back here, but I'm not sure that they ever had any direct connection with each other.
How about Susan B. Anthony, now that we've gone
Oh yeah, definitely she and Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they interacted with each other. Cady Stanton was connected, to Lucretia Mott. And so Cady Stanton had all these links into the Garrisonian and then the abolitionist world. So yeah, they definitely knew each other, and Harper stood against them in the American Equal Rights Association. Anthony and Katie Stanton showed their racism very directly when black men were put forward as the ones to receive the right to vote, and white women were not. And Katie Stanton even made this appeal to say that black women were better off trusting white women than they were black men. And Harper, disagreed with that entirely. Mary Ann Shadd Carey, however, didn't. So, but Harper was looking at the situation of black folks in the South all the time. White women's privilege and benefit could not trump the safety that was potential, at least, in black men being able to vote. So black people having some access. And it wasn't because she thought black men were better than black women. No, if you look at her literature on Southern life, for example, she's always talking about these black men selling their vote and the women having to get on their case about it. And so Harper is not, she's not clueless about this. But she's also pragmatic on some fronts. She recognizes that race cannot be overlooked. And she would not do that. Yes.
Let's have one more question. I just want to remind people our next speaker is talking about Mary Ann Shadd Carey. That's the next one. Yes.
Yes, sir. I think I missed you before, didn't I?
My hand is up and down and up and down, so I would like to bring things to the present day.
Okay.
And the history of our country is fraught with issues of power and privilege. And you mentioned two quotes, domination is good for no one, and all reforms are connected. If Frances Ellen Watkins Harper were alive today, and you were able to speak for her based on your knowledge of her works and of her passions, what might be a message she would give to us today in a society that's certainly as fragmented and fractured as almost any in our nation's history, that could be something that we could walk away with, sort of to be empowered by that vision and her passion?
Yeah.
So in a certain way, you're asking me, who would Frances Harper be today? And that's a pretty complicated question, because she would have to be transformed, which I think, because Harper was someone who adapted. She was an adaptable person. So I think that she would be in conversation with persons representing a wide variety of cultures and groups. And now that's a reason that I'm actually saying this. So you asked a question that I've been thinking about. Because, and this is going to be I need to digress just a little bit here, if you don't mind. Last year, I was introduced to the writings of an indigenous woman scientist, an eco-botanist, who teaches at SUNY ESF, so right next door to me, at Syracuse. And her name is Robin Wall Kimmerer. And Wall Kimmerer has a book called Braiding Sweetgrass. That's beautiful. It's a gorgeous book. In it, she does a fantastic critique of American culture. At the same time, without ever saying the word what she's doing is religion. I think Harper would have had a conversation with somebody like her. I think she would have joined forces with someone like Walt Kemper. Which, by the way, Harper was aware of the brutalization of indigenous people and talked about it. But you know, she didn't say a whole lot, but she talked about it in the way that she does in fiction. So she was cognizant of that injustice. And so I think she would join forces with people who are willing to say, America is always a conversation. There is a potential here because relationships are fundamental. And people who are not narrow, so I was glad about David's question, people who are not narrow in their religiosity, but open in it. Here is the possibility for a conversation about how we might be with each other. Because that's what we lack today, I think, is some sense of a commitment to the public good, of a commitment to community. And by community, I mean relationship with each other. Bringing goodwill, which means you also got to be willing to be in those hard spaces and to be challenged. To be challenged by others and not withdraw. But take that challenge and say, yeah, okay, it might stun me at first, but then which way can we go as a people? This man that Harper worked with in Maine was the editor of a newspaper, anti-slavery newspaper. It was a minister trained out of Bangor Theological Seminary. His name is Austin Willey. And Austin Willey said, democracy is conversation. And it is not packaged conversation. It's people really talking to each other. But you got to have goodwill as a foundation. We don't have that. And that is quite unsettling. So I think Harper would be unsettled by where we have come. One of the advantages that Harper had, and I tried to bring this out a little bit in the talk, is that she could assume people's identification with Christianity. She could make that assumption. That assumption cannot be made. But I don't think that Harper would see that as a problem. And that's why I brought up Walt Kemper. I could see her speaking with people of conviction from all different kinds of traditions and cultures. And that is the potential of America.
Preach it, sister.
That's right.
So when's the book coming out?
Oh, yeah. It's been a slog. You know, I've been trying to get this book out for a very, very long time. It's complicated to get all this stuff together. But the University of North Carolina has been sitting with me for a good long time. So if they don't give up, you know, I'll let you guys know.
Because I think her story and so many other stories have been lost to us, and it's so important. When you talk about how active she was, and yet we don't know enough about her.
Yeah. Well, there's all of these people out here that, you know, we're only scratching the surface with some of these folks. Thank you all.
Thank you.